Welcome to the Teacher's Guide to Best Tiered Instruction. This video will focus on 3rd grade benchmark NSO 1.4, which is to round whole numbers from 0 to 1,000 to the nearest 10 or 100. It's important to note that in grade 2, students worked on rounding whole numbers from 0 to 100 to the nearest 10 only. Begin by bringing back the 100s chart and focusing on just rounding to the nearest 10. Students must identify which digit is in the tens place value and understand that we use the ones digit to complete the number that we are rounding. So in this case, 34 is closer, and students can see the two tens that are going to be referred to as the end marks of the possibilities that it could round to. We're reviewing all of the concepts about what it is closer to. We're having conversations about the midpoint of 5 so that students start seeing when we're rounding to the nearest 10 with a 3-digit number, we still use the digit in the tens place and the ones place to determine our endpoints. Students can also start having discussions about why it's closer to one of the endpoints versus the other, talking about how many units away it is. In this case, we've now had a 0 in the ones place. So we need to make sure we're also letting students understand that when a digit ends with a 0 and it is one of the endpoints, that means that this number is already rounded to the nearest 10. So there is no closer to, it just stays the same. Once we've built up familiarity with the hundreds chart with all of the vocab, then we introduce students to a number line, vertical and horizontal, having the same conversation, but now students must identify the hundreds place value. So now our endpoints will be 100 numbers instead of tens. Again, this reinforces place value with our students as well as number sense, having the discussion again about the halfway or the midway point. Students should know that 50 is half of 100. So the pattern now will be that 50 is the midpoint between the 200 endpoints. I have students place on the number line where they think the number would go, not really focusing so much on the tens, because right now we are focused on rounding this to the nearest 100. Having students practice these sentence stems of knowing what hundreds a number exists between emphasizes their patterns of skip counting by hundreds as they skip counted by tens in the previous skill. Students often struggle with narrowing down the two endpoints. So make sure that students also reinforce or understand that the hundreds digit is always going to be my first endpoint. And then I just add another 100 to get the second endpoint. Again, having students just plop or decide which part that number lies within will then help them understand why we rounded this number down to 700 instead of up to 800. Since we often use the language of rounding up or rounding down, a vertical number line again helps students conceptually understand that language. So here we're reinforcing the same things, asking the same questions, labeling our endpoints, our midpoint, and having students plot numbers. First, students are asked to round to the nearest 100. So physically having students slide the cube down because it did not make it to the midpoint helps when we say that this number rounds down. Now that it is already plotted, now we focus more specifically on the tens place. This scaled number line would help students skip count by tens within 400 to 500. Again, having the conversation about why we're rounding up or rounding down, students need to understand we round up because it's closer to 440. Here we revisit the number that already ended with a 0, but we're having students round it to the nearest 100 as well as the nearest 10. Having a scaled number line, students place the number, physically can round up because we're now past the midpoint, and then having the conversation about the nearest 10 with, again, labeling our two endpoints, but understanding that 170 is already rounded to the nearest 10, so there is no work to be done because 170 is already rounded. After much work is done with a scaled number line, we're bringing back an open number line, but again providing the same sentence stems to students. When students often struggle with this, we talk about just pulling out the tens number that reinforces the expanded form, but then understanding that even though we've determined it's between 30 and 40, the 500 isn't going anywhere. We reinforce and have students label the conversation. Here I've used 10 unit cubes because we are rounding to the nearest 10. So students can physically split the cubes and understand that 537 is 7 units away versus 3 units away. Going back to skills students already know builds confidence within them as they progress to this new skill. The reinforcement of place value, as well as the conversation and sentence steps, just really help students conceptually understand why we round numbers the way that we do. It's really important not to teach students tricks or songs for them to memorize or box and underline numbers, because there's no conceptual understanding with that. As students move through operations, we reinforce estimating and rounding to justify whether or not answers are reasonable. This really is foundational for a lot of making sense in our real world.